Okay, this video is a general overview of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis literally means putting together using the energy from light. So photo means light, and synthesis means to put together. So plants, predominantly plants, and other photosynthetic organisms like blue-green algae, also known as cyanobacteria, and protists, which include many different types of algae, harvest solar or radiant energy from the sun and use it to combine molecules of carbon dioxide to make complex carbohydrates. And those are rich in chemical energy. So the idea is we're converting solar energy into chemical energy. And chemical energy is the form of energy that living things need in an ecosystem. So these are our producers. While we are most familiar with plants, and so we'll be focusing on plants, actually more of this is done on the planet by cyanobacteria than any other organism. But most of them live in the ocean, and we're not around them all that often, so we're not as familiar. And obviously the structure of the cells is different, so the exact mechanisms would be a little bit different. So we're going to focus on how this works in land plants. So first of all, photosynthesis takes place in chloroplasts, in plant cells and algae cells. And we're going to kind of go into a chloroplast and look at the structure of a chloroplast in more detail. So we're inside a plant cell and we're inside a chloroplast, and we've cut it open so we can see inside. Now, if you notice, there is a double membrane, so there are two phospholipid bilayers, and then even inside those two layers of phospholipids, there are small stacks of discs that are called granum. So an individual disc is a thylakoid, a stack of thylakoids is a granum, and many stacks would be grana. So the plural of granum is grana. The liquid filling inside the chloroplast but outside the granum is called the stroma. So there are four key components that a plant needs to perform photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is one, water is another, light is another, and chlorophyll, which is the green pigment that absorbs energy. So sunlight actually, even though it appears to be white to us, actually has all the different wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum ranging from red, orange, green, yellow, blue, indigo, and violet. So light energy falls along a spectrum according to its wavelength, and shorter wavelength means higher energy and higher frequency, and longer wavelength is less energy. So most pigments are active in a narrow color range, including those for our own vision. So a pigment is any chemical compound that absorbs light energy, and there are many different ones. The two most abundant are chlorophyll A and B. And they're the most important. And they appear green, and we'll explain why in a few minutes, but they absorb wavelengths in the blue and violet range and the red and orange range and reflect all of the other wavelengths. There are also accessory pigments that we see in the fall, the red and yellow pigments, that absorb additional wavelengths of light and collect some energy, but mostly they disperse extra energy to protect chlorophyll A. Those pigments are the carotenes, which are orange, xanthophylls, which are yellow, and the anthocyanins, which are blue and red. So if you look at this graph, it shows the wavelengths that chlorophyll A versus chlorophyll B absorb. Of course, there is some overlap, and they do absorb wavelengths within a similar range, but they're not exactly the same. So if you look at chlorophyll B, it kind of peaks around 500 nanometers, whereas chlorophyll A peaks at around like 425, maybe 450-ish. And these different chlorophyll molecules have a slightly different role, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the next video. But by having both types of chlorophyll, more energy can be absorbed because they absorb waves in different ranges. If you look, the green wavelength, the one in the middle, is the one that is least absorbed by chlorophyll, and it is reflected. And that's why leaves look green to us, because they're reflecting the green wavelength and it bounces off of the leaf and into our eye. So this is the molecular structure of pigments. You're never going to be tested on these, But I just wanted to show you chlorophyll A and B and how similar they are in structure. The only difference is this oxygen atom right here, which is in chlorophyll B, but not in chlorophyll A. And this is beta carotene, and this is the xanthophyll, and this is the anthocyanin. And one of the really interesting things about chlorophyll A and B is this ring structure with the magnesium atom that's actually where they pick up electrons. But if you look at this structure, this is the heme B, a component of hemoglobin, which is really, really similar in structure to the chlorophyll molecule. And its job is to carry oxygen, which is kind of fascinating. So again, this is just sort of an image that shows why leaves appear green. All of the wavelengths are absorbed except for the green, and the green is reflected. So there are actually several ways to represent the chemical formula for photosynthesis. This is the most accurate. Now, before we get into the different chemical formulas, what you need to realize is this is not one chemical reaction. This is a summary equation for many, many reactions that actually occur. So it's not that 3 carbon dioxide molecules are reacting with 3 water molecules to give us this 3 carbon molecule. It's not really quite how it works. But this is the overall balanced equation for the whole entire process. So at the beginning of the process, we use up 3 carbon dioxide and 3 water, and those are our reactants. The reactants are on the left side of an equation. And we get a product, a 3-carbon carbohydrate, which is actually called PGAL, or phosphoglyceraldehyde. And as a waste product, we get 3 oxygen molecules. It is really common for people to believe that plants convert these 3 carbon dioxide molecules into these 3 oxygen molecules. That's actually not possible. A plant can't change carbon atoms into oxygen atoms. The carbon actually ends up in the PGAL and eventually a glucose molecule. The oxygen come from water. So the carbon dioxide entered through little holes on the underside of the leaf called stomates. At this point in the unit, you've already read the bio preview about leaf structure and done a leaf lab. The water enters through the leaf veins, through the xylems, from roots to stems to leaves. And this is the sugar molecule here. We're not very familiar with PGAL. We haven't really heard about it much. We're more familiar with glucose, which is actually 2 of these bonded together. And those 3 oxygen molecules are actually waste product, and they exit through the stomates as well, through those holes on the underside of leaves. Usually in textbooks, they write this formula because people are much more familiar with C6H12O6, glucose, because that's the molecule our cells break down for energy. The most simplified version of the equation is actually the idea that it shows you 1 carbon dioxide molecule and 1 water molecule, and we have CH2O, which is the empirical formula for carbohydrates, and that we get oxygen as a waste product. Okay, so just a little bit about plant structure and anatomy. Water enters from roots to stems to leaves. Carbon dioxide enters from the air into the leaves, and sunlight hits the leaves, sugar is produced, oxygen is released as a waste product, and glucose is predominantly stored in the roots, especially during the winter. So there are 2 halves of photosynthesis, 2 phases, and both occur at the same time, but we're going to, in future lectures, break them up into their 2 halves to sort of get into more details of each one. But the first half is called the light reactions, and this is where we have absorption of light energy. Water is split into hydrogen ions and oxygen gas, and light energy is converted into chemical energy in the form of ATP. At this point, you should be very familiar with adenosine triphosphate. It's the energy currency in cells. And at the end of the light reactions, we end up with not only ATP, but a molecule called NADPH, which is used later in the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the next phase, named after the scientist who figured out all of the stages of the cycle. The light reactions occur in those little discs that I showed you earlier in this video within the chloroplast. The Calvin cycle used to be referred to as the dark reactions, but we really can't call it that anymore because it doesn't actually happen in the dark. But sometimes your teachers will still refer to it as the dark reactions because that's what it was called when we were studying this back when we were, in 9th or 10th grade. So in the Calvin cycle, we actually have the storage of chemical energy. And it's in the form of PGAL, and it's used to build many other complex compounds. And the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast, which is still inside the chloroplast, but in that liquid area outside the thylakoids. So this diagram is great because it just is a great visual summary of what the products and reactants of each half. So the gray box on the left represents the light reactions, and the gray box on the right represents the Calvin cycle. Now water comes into the leaf and is split, and the byproduct is oxygen. So the oxygen that's released comes from the water that we give plants. The two products of the light reaction that are used for the Calvin cycle are ATP and NADPH. Those are used as energy sources and hydrogen sources to make sugar. And carbon dioxide doesn't come into play until the second half of photosynthesis. And in that second half of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is used to make sugar. So down here, we really could have put C3H6O3 or PGAL or carbohydrates or general or CH2O, the empirical formula, but any kind of carbohydrate really could have gone down here. So we've been talking about ATP a lot this year, but now I'm going to show you a little bit more about the structure. If you look at an ATP molecule, it has a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. We should be familiar with that because it is a sugar found in RNA. It has a nitrogen base adenine, which we should also be familiar from both DNA and RNA. And instead of one phosphate, it actually has 3 phosphate groups, which is why it's called adenosine triphosphate, because 1, 2, 3 phosphates. Now, the one thing I don't like about this diagram is it does not show that there's actually a high energy bond between this phosphate and this phosphate and this phosphate and this phosphate. And it's often drawn as sort of a squiggly line to let you know that it's not just a regular bond, that there's actually extra energy there. But in cells, there's this constant recycling between ADP and ATP. If there's energy that has been harvested, that 3rd phosphate can be added back to ADP and to make ATP. And whenever work is done in a cell, ATP is used up. The 3rd phosphate is usually stuck onto a molecule to give it energy to do something, and then you have ADP back. It's sort of like a rechargeable battery, and ATP is the charged version, and ADP is the uncharged version, or the partially charged version. And so there's this, again, a constant recycling. Whenever energy is needed, the cell will make ATP and then use ATP to do work. So the overall reaction for photosynthesis is as follows. If we have 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water molecules, if we have light energy and chlorophyll, we can produce C6H12O6 or glucose and 6 oxygen molecules as a waste product. This could certainly also be written with 3 carbon dioxide and 3 water, giving us C3H6O3, which would be PGAL, and 3 oxygen. And that's actually more accurate, but people are not familiar with PGAL, and they are familiar with glucose. So most textbooks will go with this equation. So photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts. The light reactions occur in the thylakoids. And the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, which is the liquidy area right outside the thylakoids. And the color ranges of light that are most useful or absorbed by plants are the red and the blue and violet wavelengths.